Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the really fascinating talks. Up to now, I'm a bit hoarse as usual, but it'll be okay. So I'm just not presenting my own work. I'll present work by many of our students and postdocs and collaborators. You're welcome to go into our webpage and read more about the people who did a lot of this work in our lab. This is a salit. A salit is a songbird that is in Hebrew called rocky, wheatear, and it does the largest migration on the planet for its size. It weighs like 2 spoonfuls of sugar, and it migrates 30,000 kilometers every single year across many, many boundaries, astonishingly knowing the way, and it's not even threatened. There are many of them on the planet. So when we go to conservation across borders and boundaries, it's really fascinating which species persist, which won't, and how we do conservation across boundaries. It's quite different when I'm going to talk about compared to what we were discussing up to now. Someone's really angry slamming all the doors here. It might be the wind. But not all species are like the salit, the northern wheatear. Some species, like the stork, arrive and they actually sort of experience the conflict. What's wrong with this stork? Can anyone tell me? And if you look again, can you tell me now? There's actually an arrow stuck in its wing. And Yoav Perlman, who eventually captured it and released it from this arrow, found an arrow which seems to be a Sudanese arrow. It flew all the way to the Chula Valley in northern Israel and then continued its flight. So birds and other animals that migrate across boundaries actually experience those conflicts and many other events that we as humans create. So we try to, more and more over time, incorporate that into our conservation research and try and look at, for example, bird migration across boundaries with these maps actually showing you international agreements, showing you development index, corruption indices, and how these relate to the migration routes of animals and the various socio-political and economic factors that they need to experience and that we need to take into account when you try and do conservation. So I have a lot of things to tell you about. I'm sure I won't manage to say everything I want to say, but let's start the journey of our work and a few sort of interesting stuff we did over the last decade or so. So we're going to talk a bit about conservation decisions, challenges, and opportunities in this complex world. We can imagine there are no countries, and it isn't really hard to do, and you know, there are no borders. But from the point of view of many of these animals, there are no borders. They need to get their water. If they are coming from the Serengeti into the Masai Mara, every year 1.5 million do need to cross those boundaries, and they need that season in the Masai Mara, which happens to be in Kenya, but they actually breed in Tanzania. That cycle goes on, and those conflicts and those boundaries will influence the persistence of those animals over time. So the case study I'll present today is from the Mediterranean Basin, work with Noam and Hedley and Hugh Possingham, which was published quite a while ago. Mediterranean is fascinating because it's really complex for conservation science and planning, over 25 countries, 3 continents, lots of different animals that are threatened, both in the sea and on land, as well as in rivers, and also lots of different people with their conservation agendas, their religions, their ethics, their values, and a lot of other things that impact eventually conservation in this region. In this specific study, we tried to look at the effect of different levels of coordination across this complex region on conservation costs and on conservation outcomes eventually, using 3 different scenarios. One was sort of the John Lennon scenario, fully coordinated. The whole Mediterranean Basin acts as one region. Imagine you're an international NGO, the Nature Conservancy. You want to conserve, you don't care where you put your money, you just want to put it there efficiently and gain as much as you can for conservation. Second scenario is partly coordinated. We have the EU already somewhat coordinating within the EU with a lot of legislation, and the other areas coordinating less. And an uncoordinated scenario where single countries, which is the most often scenario, most sort of common scenario, acting independently. We took biodiversity data from IUCN, in this case for reptiles, amphibians, and freshwater fish. We took the distribution maps generated by IUCN for these species, and we then started exploring how collaboration is impacting our systematic conservation planning, which is a spatial analysis for conservation, where we decide where we can put our protected areas most efficiently. We also looked at using a decision support tool that was developed called Marxan. I'll tell you a bit more about it. Marxan is a tool that helps us maximize biodiversity benefits while minimizing the cost for conservation, which is always limited. We don't have the funds we need for conservation, and also minimizing the threats for those species that we're trying to protect. So we integrated this biodiversity threats and cost data using Marxan, which was actually developed for the Great Barrier Reef in Australia about 20 years ago, but is widely used in thousands of cases across the planet now. And we looked at the conservation costs, the threats, and some other sort of nuances of Marxan that it allows us to use. I'll skip this due to shortage of time. We had about 25,000 planning units, raster planning units of 10 by 10 kilometers, and we actually set conservation targets. What do we want to achieve in our conservation, outcomes eventually? And you get penalized when you use Marxan when you don't achieve your targets, and you're trying to minimize those penalties for yourself. So eventually we also calculated the cost for conservation for each of our planning units. We used an interesting approach, which is not totally the best approach you could use, but it was the best approach we could use at the time we did this, which was about 9-10 years ago, where we used human population density as a sort of surrogate for threat, which was quite useful in the Mediterranean. And we also used acquisition and management cost of land as a surrogate of cost, and we put them together into this metric we created. We called it the biodiversity human impact or whatever metric, and then we mapped it. But then we could integrate all our BHM and the cost and our biodiversity for these groups into our Marxan analysis, and we're trying, remember, to maximize benefits for conservation, minimizing threat and costs. And we use this for the three scenarios, the coordinated, and we could actually compare that eventually with the partly coordinated and the uncoordinated scenario and see how we're improving or not improving our conservation outcome when we coordinate our conservation decisions across boundaries. What we found was quite fascinating. We found that most of the high priority conservation areas for these groups were actually found in Europe. Many of them were in Spain. It's a pretty low-cost area for conservation, but it actually maintains many, many species and many unique species, which is really key in those Marxan runs. And we found a very large effect of coordination. We found that to achieve similar conservation benefits, you need much more money and a larger area if you do not coordinate your actions, which means if you do coordinate, you can use those extra funds for more conservation in additional regions. So that was sort of the first step. If you look at Spain, for example, in this case, this is when Spain does not coordinate its actions. These are the high priority areas selected in many of the Marxan runs. You run it, say, 1,000 times. And look at the brown area. If we don't coordinate, this is how much area you'll need to achieve your targets. If you partly coordinate, you need less area. And if you fully coordinate, you need even less area. That leaves you money to do more efficient conservation in other areas. So basically, we save a lot of money by coordinating our actions, and we also manage to either save space or use the extra funds for conservation in additional areas. So that was an interesting sort of first step. And we said, let's now look at the Mediterranean Sea. We've looked at the Mediterranean Basin, at the terrestrial area. Let's look at the sea now. And the Mediterranean Sea, again, is very complex and fascinating. We ran a couple of workshops, I think 3 workshops over the years, bringing people together from all around the Mediterranean, sitting for dinner, a bit like this workshop, working on many joint papers, which would be my recommendation from a workshop like this, bringing all these great people around the table to work on a paper that will contribute to others, a review or another paper, and just looking at spatial conservation decisions across those boundaries in the marine realm. And Tessa did her whole PhD on this with us, first in Israel, and then we moved my lab to Australia, and she continued her PhD there. She's actually an Australian. And we found that the Mediterranean, the marine environment is highly connected. Marine boundaries are not really boundaries. and many of the species are shared across those boundaries. So we asked, can collaboration between countries improve conservation efficiency? Basically the same question as we asked for the terrestrial area, can we achieve the same conservation outcomes for less cost? And we did, in this case, take 77 threatened marine vertebrate species, and we set a target of protecting 10% of the range of each of these species at least. And then we did the exact same thing, exploring the context of systematic conservation planning, running that Mark's annual really know, and using exclusive economic zones instead of countries, for example, in this case. And then we could actually look at the boundaries between those exclusive economic zones, some of which have been declared, some have not yet been declared in the Mediterranean Sea. So we ran those three scenarios, fully, partly, and uncoordinated, based on the 3 continents in this case. And we started mapping first species richness, where the species are actually, using the same spatial resolution, and then using costs. We incorporated, in this case, opportunity costs for fishing that will be lost if we decide to put a protected area in a certain area or a certain place. We looked at both commercial fishing and non-commercial fishing, in this case, as our cost. And then we looked at 3 collaboration scenarios again, using 10,000 marks and runs, and we looked at our best solutions and the percentage of areas selected, those areas that were always selected run after run, meaning they have high biodiversity, low cost, and probably lower threats as well. And we could actually look at the benefits from coordinating our actions in conservation. And once again, we're seeing that we save a lot of money by just coordinated conservation actions. Where do we want to put those protected areas? If we coordinate that across the Mediterranean Sea, we can really save a lot of funds and do it far more efficiently. So we also save, obviously, a lot of money when we do it that way. So interestingly, when we looked at it a bit more carefully, we found that while some countries, you're seeing here in blue the fully coordinated scenario, in green the partly coordinated, and in red the uncoordinated, some countries, like I say Spain, benefit a lot by coordinating. But other countries like France, they actually will need to subsidize the other countries. They don't benefit as much as others. So it's far more complex than just, we collaborate, we're going to gain. We just did a similar analysis for the Nile River, and it's now in review, the paper, and we're seeing very similar results. Some countries benefit far more than others. So it's sort of a trade-off, and it may require some, between country compensation if we actually want to coordinate conservation actions, which overall save us a lot of money. So basically, the cost of marine conservation can be reduced. If we collaborate, we may benefit, but not equally. And it's really important to assess those potential benefits for collaboration. So this has been published in a whole range of papers. You're welcome to go into our webpage, and you can find the PDFs of both of those papers over there. So I know that a lot of you are thinking for yourself, but it's not just, easy. It's very hard to collaborate. It's very hard to coordinate. Many of you work on conflict. We know that it's easier to collaborate on conservation. In many cases, we collaborate with Jordan far more on conservation-related issues than on many other issues, for example, and with many other countries around us. But there are trade-offs. There's also limitations. Collaboration or coordination may lead to less, interest, less local involvement, less responsibility. The French will do it for me. I don't need to worry here in Spain. Local populations may be really important genetically. We may spread the risk politically because one day something may happen to a priority area previously. It may lead to more top-down decisions, which are a problem in conservation, and it complicates admin and other costs. So this really needs to be traded off against the advantages, but it can be done even if you coordinate your actions. So you can always trade those off. And we further discuss it in those papers if you're interested, and also integrate into those papers some conflict and some implications of conflict in the region. So one of the fascinating papers that Nam led, and we worked together on, was looking at incorporated socio-political issues for the Mediterranean. We tried to look at more sort of geographical and economic and other factors. So what happens if we incorporate that information into the same exercise of collaboration and coordination? how does this incorporation impact our conservation plans? And these are the cool images that obviously Noam did, looking at ranking connections, current connections, not just on biodiversity as we conservationists are used to looking at, but at trade, for example, between countries, or at tourism between countries, or in shared agreements or environmental agreements between countries. So where is the potential to collaborate that will help us as conservationists? And that was really a wonderful experience, collaborating with geographers, political sciences, people from international relations. For us, very educating as conservation scientists. But we found that even the shared species between these countries behave quite similarly to those trade and tourism, interestingly. So there's a real opportunity here to collaborate across those boundaries where collaboration already exists, to expand it into collaboration in the context of conservation, and to once again look more carefully at the conflict and to those limitations in conservation around the regions. Where do we think it's a better bet to put our money for conservation, and incorporate that more systematically into our conservation prioritization and actions. So we really find that socio-economic, political, and demographic factors can be integrated into cross-boundary conservation plans, and that some countries, actually richer countries like Italy, France, and Spain, have very strong connections already. So Italy is a very central country in the Mediterranean, very important opportunity for collaborating with other countries around, and really have a key role in future Mediterranean conservation. That was also published a few years ago, if you're welcome to go into the webpage, with the nice photo we took in in the archaeological site. We did a similar analysis in the Indian Ocean recently, that was recently published. And just to almost end with this slide, picture that I really love that also Noam made. He took the BP oil spill of 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico and he imposed it onto the Mediterranean. That's the size of the spill at the top. And that's what's going to happen in the Mediterranean if we have a similar spill. Obviously, the spill is going to cross boundaries, and he modeled it with some colleagues from Chekir Amim V'Agamim, oceanography and limnology, and we're seeing how the spill goes from Egypt and Israel up into Lebanon and Syria with a very high probability. So basically, what we're finding is that collaboration really can reduce conservation costs, but has pros and cons. Conservation plans must examine trade-offs, for example, with hydrocarbons, and take into account movement of animals and biodiversity in general. So I guess just think about incorporating, your huge knowledge. We'll be very happy to collaborate as conservation scientists and improve what we do, and incorporate the pros and cons that you know much more than we do about, and incorporate new threats that require new approaches, big data and spatial analysis that we're striving, to collaborate and use more. So thanks everyone, and thanks for your attention.
We have time for 1, 2 questions. Go ahead.
Hi. So you've shown us the map of Spain, and there's collaborated and uncollaborated scenarios. And you see that the uncollaborated scenario is a larger area for conservation suggested. So basically what you say is, what I'm trying to ask is, do you change your formulas between those different situations of collaboration and coordination and no coordination? Because basically what we see here is that each country gets a smaller chunk of the conservation area, yeah. And talking also about fragmentation, so basically now you say make it more fragmented.
I'll answer you.
Yeah, and that's one. And also if you can speak of restoration, do you do anything with restoration?
So this is a bit confusing, this slide, because you're seeing that if you want to coordinate, you actually are losing protected area. But what we're trying to do, we're saying you're trying to achieve a certain conservation target. Your funds are very limited. If you coordinate your actions compared to uncoordinated actions, you actually need less money to achieve the same target, which means you can bring up your target. So you can protect more for the same money. Because conservation funds are always very, very limited. So you can achieve more for less money. If you want to protect all these areas in Spain, wonderful. If you coordinate, you can protect them and achieve much more for it. So it's a bit confusing. And definitely restoration is an option, something that I personally don't work a lot on, but many conservation scientists do work on, and we're trying to minimize costs. Conservation is a very expensive, that's mine, so I have to shut up. But basically, restoration is very expensive action, but definitely we would want to take into account in many cases. But we haven't used restoration explicitly to incorporate into our conservation decisions in this collaboration scenario. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. This was a short session.